Hi everyone and welcome to the big comparison between the Canon RF 135 1.8L versus the Canon RF 70 to 200 mm 2.8L. I borrowed the 70 to 200 mm 2 years ago at objektivvermietung.de, so if you're ever in Germany and you lost your camera and you need a camera for a job, for instance, or because you wanted to capture all nice details in Germany, then make sure to check out objektivvermietung.de. Now I took a look at the 135 1.8L version and I was like, initially, what's actually the price? And we come to that point in a second, because it seemed to be quite expensive, to be honest. A short while ago I was testing the Sony 135 1.8 GM and I was like, wow, that is actually a nice look. This 135mm lens creates such a nice bokeh and field of view, and it always seems to be the correct lens for taking portrait pictures. And I was like, oh, okay, it costs like 1,500, 1,600 euros for the E-mount. So I was quite surprised when I figured out that the RF 135 1.8L cost about 2,700 euros. I was like, wow, that is damn expensive. While for 100 euros more you get a 70 to 200 mm, well, you lose one aperture because you have only 2.8, but on the other hand, well, it gives you the flexibility to zoom. But we'll speak about this point in this video. If you're just looking for a lens that gives you that nice blur background and a fast aperture, make sure to have a look on my reviews about the Canon RF 85mm 1.2L for 3,200 euros, or the 50mm 1.2L for about 2,600 euros. And there's also the Canon RF 50mm 1.8 STM for about 200 euros. First of all, let's have a look at the bodies. The 135mm weighs 935 grams, is 98 times 130 millimeters wide. It has a maximum aperture of 1.8 and a minimum aperture of 22. 9 aperture blades for really nice round bokeh balls. Try an 82mm filter, and I can recommend one in the video description below. Make sure to use them. It doesn't matter if you need an ND filter or just a UV filter, but it saves you a lot of money when it comes to scratches on your front element. I use the RF ring to change the focus field. You can also use it to change the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO, for instance, or even the white balance. And it got a huge focus ring which allows you to focus manually. There are 2 switches at the side, one for the autofocus and manual focus and one for the image stabilizer, that the 135mm lens from Sony does not have included. And there are some programmable buttons around the lens which the 70 to 200mm does not have. And it's protected against dust and splash water. Now let's have a look at the 70 to 200mm 2.8L. It only weighs a few grams more, 1,070, without the lens hood. So it's much lighter than the EF version, which did not extend. However, it weighs almost 1,500 grams. What I like so much about the RF version is that I can easily take it in my camera bag, since it's so compact when I'm not zooming. It's 90 times 146 millimeters wide. It has a maximum aperture of 2.8 and a minimum aperture of 32, while the 135mm has a minimum aperture of 22. It also got a 9 aperture blades for a really nice bokeh, and it has a 77mm filter thread. That means if you require a filter, they are much cheaper than on the RF 135mm version. Both lenses come with a lens hood, while the 70 to 200mm has more switches at the side. You got one for the autofocus, manual focus, for the image stabilizer, and some for the distances. It got 3 rings, one programmable RF ring, which in my point of view is a bit too close to the camera, and I use it to change the focus field. Then you got a zoom ring and a focus ring. This lens is also protected against dust and splash water, and it also got a 360-degree tripod clamp included. Both lenses are equipped with an optical image stabilizer. It does a fantastic job in combination with the Canon EOS R6, R3, R6 Mark II and the Canon EOS R5. The 135mm has 5.5 to 8 stops, which is great for low light, so longer shutter speeds, and obviously for video. The 70 to 200 millimeter compensates up to 5 stops, which does also a fantastic job in combination with my Canon EOS R5 and the Canon EOS R3. I make use of the optical image stabilizer always when I take my YouTube videos, which most of the time are handheld, and especially at 200 millimeter, it does an awesome job. Let's have a look at flaring. The best thing to avoid flaring is to use the lens hood, which is provided with both lenses. And as you can see, sometimes you do see a bit of flaring. I would say a little bit more pronounced on the 70 to 200 millimeter. But if you want to avoid it, you will find a way to avoid it. And if you want to make use of the nice flaring effect with your portrait in the foreground and the sunset in the background, it gives you that nice portrait look. Let's have a look at chromatic aberrations. I would say both lenses have no real issue with chromatic aberrations. I couldn't find any, like not even a single magenta or green shimmer using the 135 millimeter, while I found some when I was pointing the 70 to 200 millimeter on some glass or metallic surfaces. But to be honest, there's no real issue nowadays because you can use the automatic correction in Adobe Lightroom to solve that issue within a second. Same applies to vignetting. What I can recommend, use the automatic correction in Adobe Lightroom if you don't like the dark edges that may appear if you're taking some pictures using a wider aperture. They are both pronounced, I would say, at their widest aperture, so 1.8 or 2.8, but if you stop down to about f4, they are almost gone, and even if they are not gone, just use the automatic correction, that's it. By the way, I give you the chance to check out the sample files in RAW in the video description below, so scroll down, download the sample files. You can have a look at the sharpness, vignetting or chromatic aberrations as long as you want at home in Adobe Lightroom in full res. Now let's have a look at sharpness. To be honest, there is not a single RF lens I used so far within the last 5 years that appears to be not sharp, not even on EF lenses. It most of the time depends on your settings or also on your camera if you're not using a third party manufactured lens from China for 50 euros. Both lenses are extremely sharp, at least where the focus point is located, whether it's on the edge or in the center. Make sure you set the correct ISO, shutter speed and the correct aperture for the scene you're in. Like if you want to take a nice photo of the landscape with a 1.8 aperture, well, there's one point that might be extremely sharp while the rest is unsharp. In this case, I would suggest an aperture of f8. And if I'm taking a portrait picture in low light and I would like to have some blur background with this nice round bokeh belts, well, I would use an aperture of 1.8 to 2.8 to have that effect, but I wouldn't wonder about a not sharp background while having an aperture of 1.8, for instance. Next thing we're having a look at is details and the minimum focusing distance, because you can do a lot with such a small focusing distance of just 70 centimeters on both lenses. So really nice for taking detailed photos and obviously videos. You get extremely close to all your subjects. I was in Frankfurt, Sachsenhausen at Hedi Schuhmacherei, which is a shoemaker from Frankfurt, and I was there to capture some details, also in video and also some RAW files, and they just look great. So you can get so close to all your subjects with both lenses, and either you blur out the background completely or you stop down and you can still capture great details, but with more sharpness. As I told you at the beginning of this video, what I like so much about the 70 to 200 millimeter 2.8 RF version is that the minimum focusing distance has reduced from 120 centimeters down to 70 centimeters. And it doesn't matter if you zoom in to 200 millimeter or at 70 millimeter, the minimum focusing distance stays the same, which is great for capturing details or shots in the nature. I also tried out to take some photos of food using both lenses. Well, you can do, and in a certain way they look great, but it wouldn't be my first choice either to have a 135 millimeter or a 70 to 200 millimeter, because I would rather get for a macro lens, let's say a 35 or an 85 or even a 50mm. Both lenses are really nice for nature shots. If you're traveling a lot and you're looking for a telephoto lens, well, in this case, I would say go definitely with the 70 to 200mm because it gives you more flexibility, because sometimes I was also out with the 135mm, but sometimes you have to go closer or you have to be further away, and that sucks after a while. If you can afford it, get the 2.8 version, and if you need to save some money for a camera or a different lens or for your trip, get the f4 version. And even with the zoom, it makes the life so much easier. You don't need to hassle around or stand in between a crowd or go in there whatsoever. You can just zoom in, and that makes life so easy. I have also a focal length comparison for you. So that's 135mm in 4K video taken with my Canon EOS R5, sometimes the R3, but 4K doesn't matter. This is how 70mm looks like on a full frame camera, while this is again 135mm and 200mm, and here we have all the scenes side by side, so you can decide for yourself if you rather prefer a zoom lens or a fixed focal length of 135mm. Let's speak about portraits. I would say both lenses are just made for taking portraits or wedding photography. I used already the 70 to 200mm to capture a wedding, and that's how it basically looks like. And I would say the 135mm this lens is made for portraits. I mean, there is no lens, I would say, which screams so much, take me for taking your portraits. Yeah, this lens gives you such a nice field of view. It seems to be always correct when you're taking a close-up of a face, for instance, and it gives you that 1.8 aperture, which allows you to completely blur out the background, and you have such a nice bokeh on this lens. And in addition, both lenses have a really nice eye tracking in combination with the correct camera and obviously this sharpness. It's just stunning. If you take on the eye out of focus and you're taking a photo of even a moving subject with a wide aperture, the eyes seem to be always absolutely sharp. The 70 to 200mm lens is also a great lens for taking portraits and obviously for wedding photography. I would say if you have to decide between any of these two lenses, and for your first wedding, I would still go with the 70 to 200mm lens because you have more flexibility. However, if you're capturing 5 weddings a week, I would probably go also with the 135mm lens because you might be able to afford it if you're capturing 5 weddings a month. I was in a church for you and I was quite surprised when I used the 135mm lens, since I could go down to a tenth of a second using ISO 640 with its 1.8 aperture to expose correctly, which is quite stunning because usually I would push the ISO up to 3200 or even 6400. The 70 to 200mm is on the other side longer in use. I use it for myself as well. It gives me much more flexibility and I have also a lot of fun using this lens for capturing portraits and details and faces. Or even at a festival, for instance, it's one of the lenses I always have in my pocket. And I'm so glad that Canon made it so compact so I can take it anywhere in my camera bag. Let's get back to the point bokeh very quick. I would say when it comes to bokeh in combination with portraits, I would say the 135mm does a better job than the 70 to 200mm 2.8. Both of them are super sharp, no matter if you shoot at 1.8, 2.8 or f4. But I would say if you're primarily taking photos in a studio and you have your camera set up on a tripod and you always want to have the same field of view, go for this 135mm lens. If you would like to be more flexible when you're shooting outside while capturing nice portraits, go with the 70 to 200mm lens. and if money doesn't play any role in your life, buy both. By the way, do you know about my preset store? If not, make sure to check out the link tree provided in the video description below. Here you will get nice presets made for Sony and Canon cameras for basically every scenario. If you're in a city, if you're having a nice portrait shooting in the sunset, or even if it's a rainy and cloudy day, you will find a lot of presets I created for Adobe Lightroom. Let's get back to the point bokeh, as we just came from taking nice portraits. I would say if I had a look now at the photos, the 135mm does have the better bokeh in my point of view when it comes to softness and these round bokeh balls. Both lenses have the same amount of aperture blades, but it looks more smoother on the 135mm version. Ideal in the darkness with lots of light in the background, or as I said, for portraits. But I would say, speaking about this point, the 135mm lens does have the better bokeh. But what is your opinion about it? Make sure to leave a comment down below. By the way, if you would like to support my channel, make sure to check out my front store. It's in the link tree provided in the video description below. There you get filters for your camera, you get a lens, you get basically everything that you require for your digital working, and you're supporting my channel and my work with that. Thanks a lot. Let's say you have nothing to do with photography and you need a great lens for capturing nice details using your camera since you're a filmmaker. Well, I would say in this case the same applies when taking photos. If you always want to have the same field of view and you have a studio and you always capturing the same thing, get the fixed focal length. If you need flexibility, get the 70 to 200mm version. Don't get me wrong, the 135mm does a really nice job when it comes to video, especially when you go out and take a nice video of a wedding day. With its 1.8 aperture, make sure to use an ND filter on that to make use of the blur background using the correct exposure. I'm speaking about the shutter speed in daylight. But sooner or later, you might feel that you require a zoom and you don't want to walk always to that spot, or you need more distance. Then I would say the 70 to 200mm version is the better choice here. I use the 70 to 200mm for many of my YouTube videos, so if you see a person in my video that is holding a camera and I'm a little bit further away and you see only a small crop of the entire scene, that scene was taken with the 70 to 200mm version, and to be honest, at 200mm you probably have the same blur background as on the 135mm with its 1.8 aperture. But the important thing is, make sure to get an ND filter for both of these lenses, since you are not getting a lens with a fast aperture to not make use of the fast aperture. You want to capture this nice blur background, and for that you need to open the aperture. So get an ND filter if you're into filming for any of these two. Also, when it comes to handheld shots, and most shots of my YouTube videos are taken handheld, I would say both of them are doing a fantastic job when it comes to image stabilization, and that is so important for longer focal lengths, especially at 200mm. It compensates a lot of vibrations. Both lenses are so sharp when recording a 4K video. Although I would use the 70 to 200mm especially for wildlife photography and for traveling. Now let's summarize. For me, it's quite easy to decide for what lens I would go for. If money doesn't play any role in your life, get both of them. Get also the Canon EOS R3 on top if you can afford it. If you shoot 2 or 3 weddings every month, no matter at what time of the year, get the 135mm lens on top of the 70 to 200mm lens, or buy both. If you only have money for one lens, make sure you decide whether you always need the same field of view or if you require a zoom. Then I would say if you travel a lot, you're taking a lot of pictures on a wedding, you're filming, you're in the nature, you're a wildlife photographer, then get the 70 to 200mm lens. If you require a faster aperture and you have the money and you have a studio, get the 135mm. And if you have a studio, you require also the space in your studio, because 135mm is quite close. And you can't go back if you have a wall behind you, and that's already the end of your studio. Also, when it comes to bokeh, I would say if you're at 200mm 2.8 and you compare it with the 1.8 version at 135mm, I don't see a big difference there. But the big point, in my point of view, is the price, because I was expecting the 135mm to cost way less than 2,700 euros, which is quite a lot for a fixed focal length, and it's not even beyond 200mm. No, we're speaking about a simple 135mm lens with an optical image stabilizer and a 1.8 aperture. However, if I only need to spend 100 bucks more to be more flexible for all my projects, I would definitely go with the 70 to 200mm version. And if I can't afford the 2.8 version, I would probably go for the f4 version and pay 1,600 euros. So the 135mm lens is a really special focal length, and if you know exactly what to do with it, get it. In any case, for any of these two lenses, I would say rent them before you buy them. Take photos or videos of a real project to see which lens fits better in your camera bag, because both of them are not quite cheap. Are you using one of these lenses? Are you using both? For what are you using any of these lenses? Thanks a lot to Objektivvermietung.de. They were so nice to rent me both of these lenses, and for one lens I decided at the end of the day to buy it for myself, and that was 2 years ago, and I'm still happy to use the 70 to 200mm in my camera bag. It's just nice for portraits, for videos, for basically everything. So I would say in general it was really easy for me to decide for what lens I would go for. But now it's your turn. Thank you very much for your undivided attention. See you very soon und tschüss.